Hello everybody, welcome to a brand new episode of The Casual Criminalist with me, your host Simon, and an episode written by Emma. Thank you so much, Emma. The Bender House of Horrors. Format of the show, if you're new here, one of my writers, writer for me, I've never read it before. We're just going to explore it together, dear audience. We're going to do a little bit of crime. I mean, not literally, we're going to read about crime. We're not going to do crimes. There will be no crimes done. As far as you're aware, allegedly. Let's crack on. My dad once told me that there's only one rule in the Wild West. You never ask a person their name or where they came from because many of them were trying to escape a life of crime back east. God, it's really good that your dad prepared you for the Wild West, Emma. My dad didn't give me any preparations about the Wild West, and I just feel vastly under-equipped for life in the modern world. Of course, since he was born in the 1960s and lived in South Africa his whole life, his superior knowledge of life in the Wild West came from Louis L'Amour's books and the old Western movies my grandmother used to watch. My knowledge of the Wild West only consists of assumptions I made based on pop culture, movies, the TV series Westworld, and the game Red Dead Redemption, so I'm not very knowledgeable about it either. Still, I think most of us have heard of infamous outlaws like Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Butch Cassidy, and the Apache Kid. Yes, indeed, mostly because I've made probably videos about all of them. And if you're from Kansas, chances are you've heard of the Bender family before. After all, their story is legend and provides us with an all-too-real and bloody view into what life in the Wild West was really like. This is one of those episodes where I'm pretty sure I've heard of these people before. I've heard of the Bender family and what they were up to in the Wild West. Probably made a video about it before, but it was either so like, I've been doing this a decade now. Like, it was a while ago if I did. So yeah, if there's some loose recollections rattling around in my brain, I'll let you know, dear listener. The Wild, Wild West. In the 1840s, more than half of what is currently known as the US hadn't been settled yet. At the time, the western border of the US consisted of Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas. The rest were simply labeled as territories. Just haven't got around to naming them yet. It's like people who have kids and they're like, I don't know what to name, it's just baby one. And then they come up with a name later. Got a map here. Oh my God, it'll go up on the screen. That is a lot of unnamed territories. Like all of the bits other than California. And what's that bit next to it? Nevada? Like the rest of those, I don't know what those are. Also, does Texas used to be even bigger than it is today? Texas doesn't have that weird tail thing pointing up to the top left, does it? No, it definitely doesn't. I feel like I'd know if it does, because that's really weird looking. Then gold was discovered in California in January 1848, and then Colorado in 1854, and by 1859, 7 new territories and 2 new states had been established, namely California and Oregon. One of these new territories was Kansas, and according to the website, Legends of Kansas, quote, the year 1859 will ever be memorable for the number and miscellaneous character of travelers to Colorado, old men and mere boys, educated and ignorant, saints and sinners, philanthropists and robbers, professional and lay, all defied hunger, cold, nakedness, and Native Americans. Why were they naked? Why did you bring clothes? In their red-hot enthusiasm for gold digging, the Great Plains swarmed with all sorts of animals and vehicles conveying men and some women with goods and chattel to the gold region. The quote ends. Towns sprang up all over the place, and for every family who moved west hoping for a better life, there was at least one band of criminals who took advantage of the fact that the law didn't have much of an influence west of the Mississippi River. Where's that Mississippi River? Is that on the map? Is that the thing on the map? That's Mississippi. That looks like a river.
Okay. Obviously, this blue part here is the land.
That's all dotted. Is that the Mississippi River? Oh, it's much further east than I thought it would be. I guess that kind of makes sense, because a lot more stuff happened in, Eastern America before they got across to the west, right? Okay, so west of the river, no laws. In the 1860s, the Osage Nation, a tribe of Native Americans who'd settled in Kansas following the Treaty of 1825, sent numerous appeals to the federal government complaining about the number of violent outlaws who were making themselves at home in their territory, but nothing was done about it. Following the end of the American Civil War, the remaining members of the Osage Nation signed the Drum Creek Treaty in September of 1870 and agreed to sell their land for $1.25 per acre. They moved south to Indian Territory, later known as Oklahoma, and soon after plots of land were marked out and put up for sale. In October 1870, 2 men arrived at a trading post in Osage Township in the northwest corner of Labette County in Kansas. The youngest of the two men introduced himself as John Gebhardt and explained that he and his father, John Bender, were both interested in buying some land. They received a tour of the plots that were available, and within the week, they bought 2 plots of land consisting of 160 acres each for $36. That'll be $863 today. Whoa, I was kind of like, well, maybe $1.25 was loads of money in the past. But obviously it's not. Although this land obviously varies. Like, in Manhattan, it's going to cost you a lot more than in the fields of, where are we? Kansas? Yeah, I feel like Kansas is pretty big. Lots of land that's not worth an awful lot. For the next 3 months, the two men spent time setting up a homestead. They built a simple wooden cabin that was 5 meters wide by 7 meters long, or 16 by 24 feet, and had been built on top of a sandstone slab that acted as the floor. Underneath the slab was a rough cellar that was 6 feet deep, and a trapdoor in the middle of the cabin provided access to it. They'd also built a makeshift barn, a rickety corral, and had dug a well, and by Christmas their work on the cabin was done. When spring came around, they'd filled the barn with a few cows, some pigs, and chickens, and started laying out an apple orchard behind the house. The people living in and around the Osage Township didn't see much of John Bender and John Gebhardt, but they were curious about what the two reclusive men got up to. John Bender was around 60 years old at the time and was described as being tall and broad, with tan skin and long hair that was wild and woolly looking. He spoke German and broken English, but never said much, and when he did visit the trading post, did play cards with the men who gathered there. John Gebhardt referred to him as Pa Bender, and after a while, the name stuck and people started referring to John Gebhardt as John Bender instead. In spring 1871, Pa Bender put up a sign above the front door to their cabin that read "Grow Cries." Is he trying to spell groceries? Dude, that is so wrong.
Me fail English? That's impossible.
Also, why did they call him Bender? Was there any explanation for that? Anyway, but apparently, Bender's so-called store barely had anything worth selling in it, and he had a habit of chasing potential customers off with a gun. John Bender was around 25 years old and is described as being handsome, tall, and slender. He spoke English and German, had grey eyes, brown hair, and moustache, and a habit of laughing at nothing, and it wasn't long before the neighbors started to believe that John was mentally challenged. He had a habit of disappearing for days on end, though that wasn't unusual since all of the men on the frontier regularly traveled between the towns on business. In March 1871, Pa Bender and John Bender were joined by 2 women, Ma Bender and Kate Bender. Ma Bender was around 55 or 60 years old and is described as being rather heavyset, with blue eyes and brown hair. She spoke German and broken English, but mostly kept to herself and didn't go into town, and was known to be unfriendly and unhelpful, so much so that in later years no one could recall what her name was. I do think about this, like people who you knew in the past who you forgotten. Like I was recently hanging out with an old mate of mine and they were like, "You remember this person?" I'm like, "No." And they're like, wait, we knew them for years. And I'm like, dude, you're gonna have to have more than that. It's just like, oh no, you completely. And then I'm like, eventually I get it. I'm like, oh my God, you just completely forget about people who just don't make an impression on you for whatever reason. Probably my fault, or probably just not got a brilliant memory or whatever. But it is kind of like everyone just forgot this woman's name because she just was just a nothing burger. Kate, or Katy Bender, was introduced as Pa and Ma Bender's daughter, despite not looking anything like Pa, Ma, or John Bender. She was around 23 years old and is described as good-looking, well-formed, rather bold in appearance, fluent talker. She had dark eyes, high cheekbones, and long auburn-colored hair. She was a skilled horsewoman, had a noticeable scar under her left eye, spoke English with a noticeable German accent, was friendly and charming, believed in free love, and within a few days every unmarried man in the region made up an excuse to visit the Benders and meet the pretty and willing Katy Bender. However, it's also reported that some of the townsfolk suspected that Katy and John were having an incestuous relationship since they acted more like husband and wife than brother and sister. But Katy would later confide in one of her neighbors that she and John Bender had already been married for some time. Oh, I see. Wait, but she's off dallying around with all the townsmen. And he's like, oh yeah, okay, gotta keep up the pretense that you're my sister, so okay. Within days of the woman's arrival, the cabin had been split in 2. At the back were 2 beds, the cooking area, and a kitchen table. The front of the cabin was transformed into a general goods store, and a wagon canvas was strung up and acted as a divider. The sign above the front door was replaced with one that said, "Groceries," correctly spelled. The Benders started advertising their cabin as an inn, and they placed a wooden table and 2 benches in the front of the cabin. Katy would meet their weary guests with a warm smile, a hearty stew, and an offer of shelter for the night. She'd order them to sit with their backs to the canvas, chatted on while she served them, and then left them in the front room to settle down for the night. The next morning, they'd stock up on provisions, enjoy a big breakfast, and then head off, resuming their journey to whichever neighboring town they'd been traveling to. But when several people started going missing after stopping at the Bender Inn for the night, everyone just assumed that they'd fallen victim to bandits, horse thieves, disease, or wild animals who regularly attacked travelers on their way to Colorado. This was the Wild West after all. Oh no, they're killing them in the shop, aren't they? And then robbing them. And just making their bodies disappear by putting them in the pigs with the pigs or something. A land of outlaws and conmen. Within weeks of her arrival in Labette County, Katy Bender started to make a name for herself, though it is not always easy to separate fact from fiction, and there are a lot of crazy stories out there regarding what Katy Bender got up to during her time in Kansas. We know that she regularly attended church in the nearby town of Harmony Grove with John Bender and soon made friends in the nearby towns of Independence and Cherryvale. She'd attend singing lessons and town meetings, visit the women to share a cup of tea and gossip, and rumor had it that a handful of men would regularly visit the Bender cabin for a few drinks, a round of cards, and a tussle in the barn if Katy was in a good mood. One of the friends the Benders made early on was a German businessman called Edward Earn. Around January or February 1871, Edward wrote to his foster mother in Germany. We don't know what her name was, so let's just call her Mrs. Foster. In his letter, Edward offered to marry her daughter and then asked the old lady if she'd be willing to move to America and come and live with them. The two foster women agreed, sold their belongings, and then left for the Americas with some jewelry, traveler's checks worth $3,200, and a trunk full of clothes. The traveler's checks today would be worth around $82,380. Good lordy lord, that's a lot of money. Also, you're just being like, hey, yeah, I'll marry your daughter, just move to America. It's not far, it's really far. Especially in the past, they're probably traveling by boat or something. When they arrived at the Osage Township around April or May 1871, so 4 or 5 months later, Edward announced that he had arranged for them to live with the Benders while he decided where they were going to settle down. Oh my god, they're definitely getting murdered and their traveler's checks are getting robbed. Don't you need to sign across a traveler's check? I remember I feel like traveler's checks are one of those things. When I was a kid, traveler's checks were a thing. And then when I first went off on my own travels, I think I was 18 years old, my dad was like, don't forget to get some traveler's checks. And I'm like, Dad, I'm pretty sure I can just get money out of cash machines. And he's like, what if you can't? You might regret it if you don't have traveler's checks. So I went down to the post office. I think I got 4 traveler's checks worth £100 or something. And I never used them. I just took them to the post office when I got back and got cash for them because nobody uses traveler's checks anymore. Nobody uses checks anymore, outside of America apparently. Despite their less than comfy surroundings, Mrs. and Miss Foster reportedly enjoyed talking to both Katy and John Bender, who could both converse in German and were full of stories about life on the frontier and the many challenges that homesteaders faced. One afternoon, the Benders and the Fosters were looking for Native American artifacts that the Osage tribes left behind. Before long, Ma Bender complained that she was growing tired, so Pa Bender led her back home, and the two foster women, Katy and John Bender, continued looking for artifacts. When they arrived back at the cabin, Mrs. Foster asked her daughter to put the artifacts they'd found away for safekeeping. But when Miss Foster opened the trunk, she realized that the box containing the jewelry and the traveler's checks was missing. Uh-oh! Since there wasn't anyone around for miles, they immediately suspected that the Benders had stolen from them, and despite Katy's claims that they had nothing to do with it, the two foster women packed their things and demanded to be taken back into town. You get murdered. John Bender agreed to take them, and for the next hour, he helpfully explains that there were a lot of horse thieves about and that they'd become a real problem in recent weeks. Maybe one of them had been in the cabin while they'd all been out for a walk. Of course, the foster women didn't believe him, and after John dropped them off in town, they immediately reported their loss to Edward Earn. Traveler's checks can't be big, right? They can't, they're just paper. Why would you leave them in what I assume is a pretty old-school, unsecured place? It feels like you should carry them on you. A furious Ed confronted the Benders at gunpoint the next day, but they insisted that they had nothing to do with the theft. Unable to prove anything, Ed left in a huff, and that Sunday at church, Katy told everyone who would listen just how ashamed she was that the Fosters had been robbed while staying under their roof. Edward and the Fosters reported the loss to Leroy Dick, Cherryvale's town trustee, who was the closest thing they had to an authority figure. But since they had no evidence to prove that a crime had been committed, there was nothing that old Leroy could do apart from reporting the theft to the German consulate and having the traveler's checks cancelled. But he promised himself that he was going to keep an eye on the Bender family from then on. In May, it's like, I'm going to keep an eye on them. It's not getting your $80,000 back there, is it? In May 1871, Katy started working as a waitress at the hotel in the neighboring Cherryvale and started advertising her services as a spiritualist and a healer. She mostly relied on word of mouth and later put an advert in the local newspaper that read, Professor Ms. Katy Bender can heal all sorts of diseases, can cure blindness, fits, deafness, and all such diseases, also deaf and dumbness. Residence 14 miles east of Independence, on the road from Independence to Osage Mission, 1.5 miles southeast of Nora Head Station. Katy claimed to be a medium and regularly hosted seances in the hotel in exchange for a fee. She reportedly also traveled to the neighboring towns to peddle her services and invited her customers to come and see her at the Bender Inn for a more personalized experience. One of her regulars was a woman named Julia Hestler, who also worked at the hotel in Cherryvale. Around May or June 1871, Katy invited Julia to the Bender Inn for a seance, and Julia agreed. She packed an overnight bag, then got on a stagecoach to Independence. She walked the 14 miles to the Bender Inn. When she arrived there that evening, Katy was setting up in front of the front section of the cabin. When Julia asked if anyone was going to join them, Katy said no, but reassured her friend that they'd have a better chance of contacting the spirits if it was just the two of them. Sounds like she's going to be contacting the spirits real soon after she's murdered. Also, did we just gloss over the fact that she walked 14 miles? God damn. Julia would also later testify, so she survives, that she'd known something was off the moment she'd stepped into the cabin. There was a bad smell in the air, and there were flies everywhere. While Katy finished setting up, Julia peeked behind the canvas that separated the store from the living area and noticed a group of flies gathered together on the floor. Grossed out, she quickly stepped away and did her best to mind her manners and not comment on the god-awful smell or the number of flies that covered every surface in the shop. Katy invited Julia to join her at the table, took Julia's hands and asked her to close her eyes. Katy then started chanting and calling for whatever spirit was kind enough to join them. The buzz of the flies was constant, and when Julia opened her eyes in the middle of the seance, they weren't alone anymore. Pa Bender, Ma Bender, and John Bender were all gathered behind Katy's back, and Julia's internal alarms started screaming. Yeah, no shit. Julia, how did you survive this? It sounds like you're about to get murdered. Julia claims that she'd hastily excused herself, then bolted out of the cabin and into the night. She ran into the tall grass that surrounded the yard while someone repeatedly shot at her, and managed to hide until she had an opportunity to make a run for it. She heard the family yelling and cursing as they lit lanterns and began to look for her, but when they turned their backs, she got up and didn't stop running until she reached Joe Newman's cabin the next morning. Oh yeah, she's miles in the middle of nowhere. This is like some horror movie shit right here. We don't know if Julia told anyone about what happened that night. We also don't know if she simply thought that no one would believe her. After all, despite their strange beliefs, Katy and John Bender were both well liked in the area, and the Bender Inn was a popular hangout. Despite being like 14 miles from anywhere, back in the day, it's really far. One of the men who regularly spent some time at the Bender Inn was a man named Jack Reed. He grew up in the area and is described as being a good-natured layabout who spent his time drinking in the saloon and gambling in the hotel. Whenever he traveled between Cherryvale and Independence, he always made a point of stopping at the Bender Inn to see Katy Bender. Sometime in July 1872, he was passing by the cabin when he recognized two horses that belonged to his gambling buddies and decided to drop in. The three of them spent the afternoon at the Bender Inn eating and drinking and made plans to meet up in Independence the next day to go gambling. When the three of them prepared to leave, Katy Bender invited Jack to pass by the cabin on his way to Independence so that she could wish him luck. Katy Bender! The next day, Jack decided to ditch his two friends and spend the night at the Bender Inn, as with Katy, before joining up with his gambling buddies in Independence. Reed explained that Pa Bender and John Bender were out of town that night, and he and Katy played cards in the front end of the cabin, while Ma Bender slept in the living area. After dark, the two men stopped by the cabin on their way to Independence. They were friends of Jack's and had recognized his horse. Katy seemed bothered by the interruption, and when Jack asked his friends to relay a message to his gambling buddies who were waiting for him, Katy said that they shouldn't be surprised if he never arrived because Reed doesn't know how to keep his word. Reed doesn't know how to keep his word because you're gonna murder him, Katy, allegedly. This snarky comment caused a little tension, and after the two men left, Katy went to bed. Jack slept in the front of the cabin and used his saddlebags as a pillow. They were full of money that he planned on spending in Independence, so he didn't want to let them out of his sight. That money is going to someone else's pockets, and you're going to be communing with the spirits, Jack! During the night, Jack heard a wagon approaching the Bender Inn. He heard Katy talking to some men outside, whose voices he recognized as belonging to John and Pa Bender. He then heard the telltale sign of a struggle before there was a loud thump and some gurgling. Oh God, he's been murdered and he's gurgling on his own blood, isn't he? Convinced that he'd just heard the Benders murder someone, Jack feigned sleep. The next morning, he got up early and hurriedly left for Independence, but when he told his friends what had happened, they laughed it off. But Jack was convinced that Katy Bender had planned on murdering him for his money that night, and the only reason he was still alive was because his friends had stopped by, and if he'd gone missing, they would have told the authorities that he'd spent the night at the Bender Inn. 18 years later, Jack Reed would be called in as a witness during Kate and Ma Bender's murder trial. Missing. In October 1872, two boys went fishing at Big Hill Creek about a mile away from the Bender Inn and came across a body floating in the water. They hurried back home to tell their parents what they'd found, and later that day, a small crowd looked on as the body was dragged out of the water and placed on a sheet. It was then taken to Independence, where the local newspapers would publish the victim's description in an effort to identify him. An inquest was held on the 8th of October, and the coroner explained that the victim had been repeatedly hit over the head with a blunt object, fracturing his skull in several places. That his throat had been slit and had most probably bled out before his body was dumped in the creek. Around the 17th of October, the man was identified as the 40-year-old William Jones, a farmer from Montgomery County. According to his wife, Martha, he had been helping to build a schoolhouse in Osage Mission and was expected to arrive back home at the end of September. At the time of his death, he had $250 in his possession that he planned on using to settle the loan they'd taken out to pay for their new farm. The newspapers reported that Martha was now a widow with 3 young children and $250 in debt, and the community immediately suspected that the owner of the plot of land where William's body had been found, Mr. R.M. Bennett, had something to do with his death. Mr. Bennett in turn insisted that they were welcome to search every inch of his land, and the men who took up his offer discovered wagon wheel tracks in a patch of dried mud near the creek. One of the back wheels were wobbly and left a distinctive track in the mud. It was then speculated that this would result in the wagon making a rattling sound as it drove, and after the men had inspected Mr. Bennett's wagons, they confirmed that it didn't have wobbly wheels and didn't rattle, so Mr. Bennett was no longer a suspect. This is proper, old-school Sherlock Holmes shit. In the months following William Jones's murder, 4 more men disappeared after passing through the area. The 29-year-old Henry Mackenzie was one of them. In November 1872, he had been on his way to Independence to visit his sister and stopped in Cherryvale to say hello to his cousin, Leroy Dick, Cherryvale's town trustee. He'd spent the night there, and when Leroy and his wife warned their cousin that men had been going missing in the area, Henry reassured them that he was a soldier and he could look after himself. Henry spent the next night in the home of local homesteader J.H. Sperry and left for Independence the next day. He never arrived. Benjamin Brown was from Cedarville in Howard County and had traveled to Osage Mission with $50 in his pocket, hoping to secure a loan so that he could purchase a farm for himself, his wife Mary, and their 2 children. He was denied a loan, so he decided to head to Independence and try his luck there. He traded for a new horse in Ladore, but never reached Independence. William McCrotty was an Irishman and Union Army veteran. He'd been heading to the land office in Independence in the hope of settling a land dispute. He'd arrived in Ladore, tired and hungry, and a man named Dan Gardner gave him 25 cents and told him if he needed food or shelter for the night, he should stop by the Bender Inn. In December, George Lancor and his 2-year-old daughter, little Mary Ann, were moving back to Iowa to live with his in-laws following the death of George's wife, Mary Ann, and their son. Oh, God. Wait, so this guy, he's got a 2-year-old daughter and his wife and their son have just died. He's going to get murdered? Oh, I don't like that. They say goodbye to their neighbors and good friends, Dr. William York and his wife, who was also Mary, and their 3 children, and set off for Iowa in their new wagon and a team of 4 horses. But it was the middle of the winter, and when a sudden cold front had snow coming down in droves, George pulled up to a lone cabin in the middle of nowhere, hoping to find shelter so that little Mary Ann wouldn't die from the cold. But when the new year arrived, Mary Ann's concerned grandparents wrote to Dr. York and told him that George and the 2-year-old Mary Ann had never made it to Iowa. Oh no, they killed her. I don't understand it, but it's like, okay, you're murdering people for money and stuff, but a 2-year-old dude, come on. During the Civil War, Dr. York was an assistant surgeon in the 15th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Infantry. He was captured by the Confederates, and after the war ended, he had several scars on his body that told the story of his stay at Camp Ford. He married Mary, and the 2 of them moved to Onion Creek, a small settlement 7 miles south of Independence, where they started a family. The couple had befriended George Lancor shortly after his wife's death and helped to raise the newborn Mary Ann. When news reached the York family that George and Mary Ann had disappeared, Dr. York was already planning a trip to Fort Scott, where his father lived, and decided to see if he could find out what happened to George and Mary Ann. Dr. York left for Fort Scott on March 3, 1873, and spent the night in Independence, where he visited his brother, Senator Colonel Alexander York. He then travelled north to Moorhead, where, according to newspaper reports, a wagon had been found abandoned. He identified the wagon as having belonged to George Lancor and informed the local authorities that he suspected foul play. Then he made his way to Fort Scott. He spent 4 days visiting his parents and purchasing several trees, shrubs, flowers, and vegetable seedlings from their nursery as a gift for his wife so that she could expand their garden. Honey, I'm home. I brought you work. He also bought a new horse, which was described as being very fine, along with a new saddle and bridle. During his last night in Fort Scott, Dr. York told his father about the disappearance of George and Mary Ann Lancor and that he was planning on investigating the disappearance. He told his father that he planned on stopping at every homestead along the route George planned on taking and would then gather a group of men to help him look for them once he got back to Independence. Together, they wrote a letter to Colonel York and the sheriff in Independence to tell them of Dr. York's plans, and Dr. York left Fort Scott the next morning. According to Mary York, quoting here, since he had said he should probably be gone from 10 to 14 days, I did not really expect him to come home until March 18th. And now, expectation was on tiptoe, for the 18th of March had at last arrived. But it brought not my husband. When Colonel York wrote to their father to ask whether Dr. York had decided to stay in Fort Scott a little longer, their father grew worried and called the next train to Independence. When the two men arrived at Dr. York's homestead in Onion Creek the next day, Mary York confirmed their worst fear. William was missing. The Posse. I've heard of frontier justice before, how groups of armed men would hunt down outlaws and criminals, mow them down, drag them behind their horses, or hang them from trees without so much as a hello or a how do you plead. The closest I ever came to seeing a posse was when I was 5. Our dogs had been barking all morning, and when my mum went up to investigate, she saw that they'd cornered a ring-snaked spitting cobra next to our house. That sounds, I don't know what a spitting cobra is, but it sounds scary. My dad was at work, so my mum called one of our neighbours for help, and a group of 10 to 15 black men arrived within the hour, holding pitchforks, shovels, hose, and bricks. I watched through a window as the men surrounded the cobra and threw bricks at it. They managed to stun the snake, then chopped it to pieces and burned its remains to warn other snakes away. Oh my god, do snakes really, are they that smart? They see like a burned version of themselves and are like, oh, holy shit. Or are they like, huh? And that's it, because they're a snake. They don't have a big brain, just like, huh? The way they'd arrived, singing and chanting and shouting curses at a snake that had done nothing to any of them, probably doesn't compare to a group of 100 well-armed, pissed off, and bloodthirsty men on horseback who are hunting for the persons responsible for a number of disappearances in the area. Colonel Alexander York and his youngest brother, the 21-year-old Edward, followed Dr. York's proposed route from Fort Scott to Independence and stopped at every homestead along the way. Edward reportedly outright accused several people of murdering his brother, and many people were pissed off at the York brothers' blunt way of investigating Dr. York's disappearance. James Roach, one of the men they'd accused, wrote to Governor Thomas Osborne shortly after and asked him to intervene in the search for the group of people responsible for the disappearances, explaining that, quoting here, "We are all poor and we want help from the state, and we want it now, and we need it so that we will spare no time until we bring the guilty parties to justice." When Edward York and a group of men stopped outside Leroy Dick's house, they asked him if there were any suspicious people in the area who might be worth checking out. After some consideration, Leroy Dick told them about the Benders, that they'd been accused of robbing the Fosters, and that some dark rumors were doing the rounds about what they got up to at night. Oh my god, they're like out looking for the people who've gone missing, like who's responsible, and he's like, oh yeah, there's these people, there's rumors about them making people go missing. First, stop the Benders! On the 4th of April, 1873, a group of 75 men searched the area around the Benders' cabin for any sign of Dr. York. Look under the floorboards in the back room. Look where the flies are. Flies are a big clue. Meanwhile, Colonel York and 2 others arrived at the Bender Inn and were introduced to Katy, Ma Bender, and John Bender. Colonel York introduced himself and explained that he was looking for his missing brother. Colonel York will later tell Mary York that Ma Bender had denied ever meeting Dr. York, but later admitted that he'd stopped by the cabin for lunch. Katy offered to use her skills as a medium to help Colonel York track down his missing brother, but Katy claimed that she'd need more time to consult with the spirits and that he should come back that evening. Careful, son. Don't go back that evening by yourself. Make sure you go with your crew. John Bender offered to show Colonel York and his men where a band of outlaws were known to hide out, and then spent the afternoon chuckling to himself as they searched the area, convincing Colonel York that he was a bit touched in the head. That evening, Colonel York and his men left, and Colonel York concluded that, quote, "These are just simple, credulous folk under the hallucination that Kate has supernatural powers." What a man of reason. Wow, good for you, Colonel. They returned to Cherryvale, and Colonel York wrote his own petition to the governor, asking for his assistance in capturing the organized band of outlaws who are spreading in many localities and whose actions rendered life and property unsafe. Governor Osborne agreed and declared a reward of $500 per head for the capture of the persons responsible. On the 8th of April, a meeting was held in Harmony Grove to organize a thorough search of the area. The organizers told the local newspapers that they would, quote, make every effort in our power to detect and bring to justice the murderers. But on the 12th of April, the Headlight reported that yet another wagon had been found abandoned on the outskirts of Thayer, a busy railroad town. The horses were still hitched to the wagon, and they were starving, and the local authorities explained that the wagon was old and dirty. Its back wheels were wobbly and made a rattling sound when they drove it to the local stables for safekeeping, and on the back of it was a loaded rifle and a wooden sign that read "Grow Cries." As in, like, their misspelling of grocery, so it's their truck, isn't it? Okay. Hell's Half Acre. On the 15th of May, 1873, the following article was published in the Kansas City Times. Devilish deeds, fearful and diabolical butchery in southern Kansas. A farm planted with corpses. 8 bodies already discovered. 4 persons implicated. How a family of human hyenas preyed upon the passers-by. What follows? Its facts may read like the recital of some horrible dream, wherein nightmare mirrors upon the distempered brain a countless number of monsters and unnatural things, yet what is set down in the narrative is as true as the sun. However, most of what is reported in that article is actually bullshit, and it reads like a cheap horror filled with claims of witchcraft and sacrifices made to the devil. The facts are much simpler. On the 4th of May, 1873, a farmer named Billy Toll was busy rounding up his cattle when he passed by the Bender Inn. He heard an animal cry out, and when he went closer to investigate, he saw the Bender's animals were starving and that most of them had already passed away. He gave the remaining ones some water and food and then investigated the cabin itself. It had been abandoned, and the farmstead reeked of death. Billy Toll reported his discovery to the authorities in Harmony Grove, and according to Leroy Dick, Billy was as elated at the prospect of spreading the news as a cub reporter with his first big scoop. The next morning, Leroy Dick and 2 others visited the Bender homestead. Leroy was planning on drawing up an inventory of all the things the Benders had left behind so they could see which items were worth selling, but it wasn't long before he realized that this wasn't just another family who'd upped and left when life on the frontier became too hard. The first thing he noticed was the smell, which he compared to the smell of a bloody battlefield after a few days of fighting. The smell was even worse inside the cabin, and they had to cover their faces with handkerchiefs to block out the worst of it. The cabin itself was dirty and covered in flies, and from the mess they'd left behind, it was clear that the Benders had left in a hurry. While looking around the house, Leroy Dick collected 3 bloodied hammers, a shoe hammer, a claw hammer, and a 6-pound sledgehammer, and would later stash them in his saddlebags for safekeeping. The men found the trapdoor hidden underneath a mattress, and when they opened it, they were hit with a sickening stench that, quote, almost drove them from the house. It convinced Leroy Dick that the Benders had hidden a body somewhere. Oh, they've hidden bodies, all right. Leroy Dick reported their findings to Colonel York, and on the morning of the 6th of May, a group of men armed with plows and shovels descended on the Bender homestead. They lifted the cabin and moved it aside. Oh, this was like a really temporary thing, more like a shed. And they dug out the sandstone slab to gain access to the cellar. Billy Toll would later testify that the soil underneath the cellar was soaked with rotting blood, but they didn't find any bodies buried there. Edward York joined the search, and that afternoon they searched the apple orchard. They had discovered several spots that resembled graves, and over the next few days they would uncover 8 bodies in total. Their bodies were then placed in wooden coffins and left next to their graves so that they could be identified. Edward York identified the brother of his body, Dr. William York. Leroy Dick identified the body of his cousin, Henry Mackenzie. William Crotty had a tattoo on his forearm that listed his name, date of birth, and his regiment. It's very convenient, well done. Benjamin Brown was identified after a horse trader from Ladore recognized his silver signet ring. A man named James Feerick was identified by a neighbor, and the body of a man named either John Geary or Johnny Boyle was pulled up from the well. George Lanker's father-in-law had traveled to Independence to look for them and identified his body, as well as the body of his granddaughter, little Mary Ann, who had never actually met. I don't like it. The coroner would later explain that the men had most likely all stopped at the Bender Inn, and all were people that the Benders must have thought wouldn't be missed by any of the locals. Their unlucky guests then sat with their backs to the canvas that acted as a divider, and it was Kate's job to distract them with food or conversation. Someone, either John Bender or Pa Bender, would then repeatedly hit them over the head with one of the 3 hammers that were found inside the cabin. Their bodies would be placed next to the trapdoor. before their throats were slit and then be left to bleed out. Once that was done, their bodies were buried in the orchard. Little Mary Ann didn't suffer that fate, though. She was most likely smothered to death after the Benders had murdered her father. The cause of death of men buried in the orchard matched the cause of death of William Jones, the man whose body was found in the creek, as well as the cause of death of 2 other men who'd been murdered while camping nearby. They were also added to the list of Bender's victims, bringing the total up to 11. In the coming weeks, the authorities learned that the Benders most likely murdered their victims so that they could steal their horses and whatever money they had on them. John Bender was a horse thief, and he would take their victims' horses and whatever valuables they had and meet up with an outlaw from Texas named Frank McPherson, or a member of the McPherson gang. The McPhersons would then buy the horses and whatever loot John Bender had on him, and then travel back to Texas to sell them. This was supported by a witness statement by a horse trader from Albuquerque in New Mexico who admitted to buying Dr. York's horse a few weeks after his murder. On the 17th of May, 1873, Governor Thomas Osborne published the following proclamation. $2,000 reward. Whereas several atrocious murders have been recently committed in Labette County, Kansas, under circumstances which fasten, beyond a doubt, the commission of these crimes upon a family known as the Bender family, and whereas said persons are at large and fugitives from justice, now therefore I, Thomas A. Osborne, Governor of the state of Kansas, in pursuance of law, do hereby offer a reward of $500 for the apprehension and delivery to the Sheriff of Labette County, Kansas, of each of the persons above named. No dead or alive? It feels like it should finish with dead or alive. The Witch Hunt. In the days and weeks after the bodies were discovered in the orchard, the stories that were told about the Benders became more and more sensational as time went on, and the newspapers got a lot of details wrong. Yeah, newspapers, media today is still a bit of a mess, but like back in the day, they'd just be like, hey, we don't know the details, let's just make it up. Oh, we don't have a story, let's just make one up. It's like historians really far back in the day. It's like, I heard this from some guy who heard it from someone. It's history now. We'll write it down in a book. Done. Easy. The article, Devilish Deeds, describes the Benders as follows. Brothers William and Thomas Bender lived in the house with their wives. William Bender, the oldest of the brothers, had a wife who was a spiritualist. The balance of the Benders called her a medium, the neighbors a she-devil. She was 42, with iron grey hair, ragged at the ends, and thin over the temples. Her eyes were steel grey and hard. The light that came from them was sinister and forbidding. She had not a single prepossessing feature. Her form, angular and tall, seemed to lift itself when the spiritual influences took possession of it and became not only gigantic in height, but supernatural as well. At times she dealt in incantations and the boiling of herbs and roots that had charms and spells about them. Her will was indomitable. All the household feared her, dreaded her, obeyed her, and as the sequel proves, they did the devil's work for her. This sounds like it's just so made up. Wait, did they even get the relationships of the people wrong? And also, was she that old? And also, she never ironed her hair, and wasn't she quite good looking? In her book, Hell's Half Acre, author Susan Jonasus explains that the American public became a little obsessed with the story of the Benders. Witnesses to their crimes crawled out of the woodwork and happily told reporters just how they'd also stayed at the Bender Inn and been able to escape a grisly fate. As the little extract from the article Devil's Deeds prove, most of the stories were rarely based on fact, and according to Susan Jonasus, debate raged over whether Kate Bender was a young woman of repulsive appearance or a buxom, good-looking country girl. The more disorganized newspapers ran multiple articles contradicting one another, leaving readers wondering how she could be both well-formed and an infernal hag. Hundreds of people visited the Bender Inn in the days following the discovery of the bodies, stealing handfuls of dirt and whatever little souvenirs they could get their grubby little hands on them. That's so weird. I understand if there's one weirdo who's into that, but hundreds of people coming to just grab a bit of dirt from a murder house? That's real weird, guys. When they'd looted everything that had been left in the building, they tore the cabin apart and took pieces of it home. Photographers who'd witnessed the bodies being uncovered sold prints of the scene, marking the locations where the bodies were found, and Leroy Dick proudly displayed the 3 hammers they'd found that were thought to have been the murder weapons. Meanwhile, dozens of people were out looking for the Benders, and despite the fact that there weren't any photos of them and no one really knew what they looked like, sightings of them were reported almost daily. Some reported that they'd fled to either Texas or New Mexico. Others claimed they were hiding away in Indian territory. Others claimed that they'd made their way into Mexico or had been hunted down and killed by vengeful posses. One sea captain claimed that the Benders had attempted to escape to Mexico in a hot air balloon, but had been caught in a storm and had been forced to land on the deck of his ship. The odds of that are just astronomically slim. However, no one ever claimed the $2,000 reward that had been placed on their heads. Oh wow, $500 each. That's so much money back in the day. 16 years would go by before the newspapers started reporting that Katy Bender and Ma Bender had been found. Oh my god, like jump to the future or what? And they were due to stand trial. Now, before you get too excited, no, they weren't the real Kate and Ma Bender. They were Sarah Eliza Davis, a single mother of 3 children, and a mother, Almira Monroe. Sarah is described as being an ignorant, superstitious woman and had worked as a washerwoman for a spiritualist and orphan named Frances McCann. One afternoon, Frances told Sarah that she'd dreamed she'd witnessed a man being murdered by 2 women, and Sarah reportedly said, quote, "Don't tell any more of that story. It is no dream but a reality, and I know all about it. The man murdered was John Sandford, your father, and he was killed by my half-sister. I was present, and so were you. You were only about 3 years old." Frances then became suspicious about her employee's so-called criminal past and accused Sarah of being the infamous Kate Bender. Sarah fled to Niles, Michigan, to escape the accusations, but Frances followed her there, and after Frances met Almira Monroe and spoke to some of the locals, she was even more convinced that she'd found the infamous Bender woman. She wrote to the authorities in Labette County to tell them of her suspicions, but they wrote her off as a crank who was laboring under a delusion. However, around the same time, Sarah Davis approached a police officer and accused her mother of being Ma Bender. Almira, in turn, accused her daughter of larceny, and the 2 of them were arrested. What is larceny? Is larceny theft? Is that theft? Look up. Yeah, unlawful taking of personal property. Okay, it's just like an oldie word for theft. While in custody, the 2 women continued to hurl insults at each other, and Almira went on to also accuse Sarah of being Kate Bender. However, she insisted that she'd only read about her daughter's crimes in the paper and hadn't been involved with them herself. In an attempt to clear their names, the authorities in Michigan sent Leroy Dick a picture of Almira so that he could either confirm or refute Sarah's claims that her mother was Ma Bender. Unfortunately for them, Leroy didn't know Ma Bender all that well and reportedly confirmed that the middle-aged Almira resembled the now 73-year-old Ma Bender, claiming that heavy old figure, that peculiar squint as she peered out, were too characteristic to allow me any further doubt. Except for the fact that she looks 20 years older than she should be. At least. Sorry, 20 years younger, my bad. The local authorities weren't convinced, but the 2 women were still sent to Labette County to stand trial for the Bender murders. Most of what we know about the Benders came out during this trial, but the majority of the witnesses who'd met both Katy and Ma Bender confirmed that Sarah and Almira didn't resemble the Bender women. The lawyer was able to prove that at the time of the murders, census documents and Almira's prison records proved that they hadn't been living in Kansas, and the 2 women were declared to be innocent and were sent back to Michigan. According to Wikipedia and most of the other sources on the Bender family, that's where their story ends. But when Susan Jonasas published her book, Hell's Half Acre, in March 2022, she promised that it contained the untold story of the Benders, and it does not disappoint. What happened to the Benders? According to Susan Jonasas, the majority of sources key to the construction of this book are those held at the Kansas Historical Society State Archives. They include the boxes of governor's records in which the unwieldy nature of the search for the Benders becomes apparent. According to these documents, Colonel York had paid 2 men, a Detective Thomas Beers and a Colonel Charles Peckham, to find the Benders. Detective Beers and Colonel Peckham managed to determine that after Colonel York had left the Bender Inn on the afternoon of the 4th of April 1873, the Benders had hastily packed their things and hitched their horses to their rattling wagon and made their way to Thayer. They abandoned the wagon and made their way into town on foot. Pa Bender bought 4 train tickets to Humboldt, Tennessee, and the 4 of them had boarded the 903 train from Cherryvale. They arrived in Humboldt the next morning and ate breakfast at the Sherman House Hotel. Pa and Ma Bender then headed back to Missouri, and Kate and John Bender boarded a train to Texas. Kate and John jumped off the train at one point, and around the time Billy Toll realized that they'd abandoned their homestead back in Kansas, all 4 of the Benders had met up again in Denison, Texas. Shortly after, Frank McPherson joined them, and the 5 of them traveled on to Red River Station, where Frank's brother and the leader of the McPherson gang, William McPherson, aka Missouri Bill, took them in. Detective Beers and Colonel Peckham arrived in Red River at the beginning of June 1873 and started asking if anyone had seen the Benders. A local cowboy told them, if the Benders was with Frank, they'll be at Missouri Bill's place at the cattle station. The 2 met with Missouri Bill, who promised to take them to where the Benders were camped for a fee. Then led them around in circles for several days before abandoning them in the middle of nowhere and forcing them to make their way back to civilization on their own. Bill warned the Benders that the law had found them, and the Benders and the McPherson gang left the area. Colonel Peckham went back to Kansas at the end of June, and Detective Beers continued the search on his own. He learned that the McPhersons and the Benders had made camp at Mud Creek in the Chickasaw Nation and paid a guide to take him there. By the time they arrived in Mud Creek, the McPhersons and Benders had already left for Clay County in Texas. By October 1873, Detective Beers was told that the search was proving to be too expensive, and he was ordered to abandon the hunt and go back to Texas. 6 years later, on the 20th of September 1879, Joseph Nicholson, the superintendent of the Detroit House of Corrections, wrote the following to Johnson John, the new governor of Kansas, quoting here, "Dear Sir, I have a man confined here who claims to know where the Bender family are, who I think could be induced to disclose their whereabouts for a much less consideration than was offering. Should you think it best to pursue the inquiry further, I will give you every assistance in my powers. I feel satisfied this man knows much about that gang that might be turned to give account should you deem it worth your time." Prisoner was a man named Samuel Merrick. He had been an outlaw and a horse thief and claimed to have met the Benders on several occasions over the previous 6 years. His accounts of the Bender movements matched several confirmed reports that had been sent in by the detectives hunting for them, and makes him the last known person to have seen the Benders. In his detailed affidavits, Merrick explained that he had first met the Benders back in July 1873 after leaving Mud Creek. The Benders and the McPhersons traveled to Henrietta in Clay County, Texas, and were staying at a homestead that belonged to a friend of Missouri Bill's called Floyd Slimp. Samuel Merrick met them when he paid a visit to Slimp and his family, and Slimp introduced the Benders as his cousins from Kansas. Bar Bender and Katy were both wearing men's clothing, and Katy was going by the name Jenny Gardner on account of her being in all the papers. According to Merrick, Kate was pretty good looking with her red cheeks and had no issue telling him everything about their life back in Kansas, although she never mentioned the murders. Surprise! During his visit, he was part of a discussion about where the Benders should head next, and it was decided they would either go to Little Wichita or head north into the Chickasaw Nation, since the law was less likely to follow them there. According to Katy, they weren't afraid to live out in the wilderness for a while, since they were all armed with, quote, Winchester rifles and the new Smith & Wesson pistols, 2 apiece. For the next few months, several people reported spotting the Benders and the McPherson gang around Little Wichita, Big Wichita, and Henrietta, and another detective named James Sullivan went looking for them. He started his search in Colorado, since he knew that the McPherson gang regularly sold their stolen horses there. But when he didn't find any trace of the Benders there, he wrote to Missouri Bill to ask for his help tracking them down, and once again the outlaw agreed to take Sullivan directly to the Benders in exchange for a fee. Around Christmas 1874, the Benders were hiding out with the Slimp family again when the news reached them that James Sullivan was snooping around Henrietta looking for them. According to Samuel Merrick, John Bender purposefully went into town to see James Sullivan and even went so far as to greet him on the street without being recognized. Quote, he told Floyd Slimp he was not afraid of that man, he was too stylish. The next time Merrick met up with them was in December of 1875. The Benders were part of a large outlaw colony living in the wilds of the Chickasaw Nation, and John Bender and the 63-year-old Pa Bender had become buffalo hunters to support themselves. During his visit, Katy reportedly told them, I hate living like a prairie dog. No bed, no dresses, and no money to fix up even a little bit. This was the last official sighting of the Benders. Their protector, Missouri Bill, died of pneumonia in prison shortly after, and Samuel Merrick was arrested for horse theft in 1877. In his affidavits, he claimed that the Benders hadn't planned on staying on the plains much longer. Quote, they have either gone further south on the Staked Plains or the Guadalupe Mountains. Within the next 2 decades, the story of the Bender murders became a legend, and their whereabouts has remained a mystery. According to Susan, quote, the Benders live on because the story of their crimes does not have an ending, and unsolved mysteries have the greatest afterlife. The family themselves are ghosts in their own narrative, patched together through the voices of those who knew them and those who lost loved ones to their crimes, and those who continue to tell stories passed down through generations. So, wait, they murdered all these people and then just go on the run and just disappear, and that's that? What? But is it possible that we already know what happened to at least 2 of the Benders? Ooh, okay, here we go. In 2004, author Phyllis De La Garza published a book on the Benders titled Death for Dinner, The Benders of Old Kansas. In 2013, she wrote an article titled History, Mystery Solved, Hiding in Plain Sight, and explained that after her first book was published, a fan named Jan Peterson contacted her and told Phyllis that it's entirely possible that John and Katy had both ended up in Colorado, the very same place where Missouri Bill used to sell his stolen horses, and had both been buried there. Jan sent Phyllis photos of their graves, and Phyllis traveled to the small town of Glenwood Springs to investigate. She spent months going through historical records and newspapers that were published at the time, and she added an afterword to her book in 2014, including all the information she'd found and her new theories on what happened to the Benders. Unfortunately, her publisher went out of business. Phyllis de la Garza lives off-grid in Arizona, and I haven't been able to find a digital copy of her 2014 book anywhere, despite scouring the internet and roping in Matthew Markham and the members of the Discord channel. I also didn't want to pay the $50 plus it would have cost to mail a physical copy to South Africa, but shout out to Excelsior's Baby Driz and Zion Bell, who all kindly agreed to help me check their local library records for a copy. Yeah, just go check out the copy and then, allegedly, take some photographs of it. Because that's not piracy. However, Phyllis's 2013 article gave me enough information to conduct my own research and confirm the claims she made. Historical records show that Joseph Joe Bender was born in Germany in 1843 and emigrated to Missouri in 1864, aged 21, where he started to work as a blacksmith. Katy, or Catherine Christiana Müller, was born in 1846 in Germany and immigrated with her parents to Missouri when she was 3. She had 5 siblings in total, and according to findagrave.com, her parents lived and died in Missouri. Joe and Katy were married in Hermann, Missouri in 1868 and lived in Cairo in 1870, but then they disappear from local records. Joe was 27 and Katy was 24 years old at the time, the same age the younger Benders were when they moved to Osage Township, which is roughly 300 miles southwest of Cairo. The next time Joe and Katy made an official reappearance is in Colorado in 1878, 5 years after the Benders had escaped from Kansas, and 3 years after Samuel Merrick last saw John and Katy in the Chickasaw Nation roughly 800 miles away. At the time, the settlements in the Rockies were nothing more than tent towns and were reportedly populated by, quote, gamblers, gunslingers, and sex workers. Joe continued to work as a blacksmith, and the two of them lived in Salida for a time, where Katy opened a hotel. They then moved to Glenwood Springs in 1886, and the local newspaper reported that, quote, Ms. Katy Bender is back from Glenwood Springs and says she and Joe are putting up a saloon and hotel there. She also says business is pretty well overdone. Sorry to lose Mrs. Bender, and we are sure no more kind-hearted women will ever run a hotel here. They just got away with this shit and went on living their lives. By then, Joe was 43, Katy was 40. The two of them had bought a property on 7th Street and owned a tavern. 2 years after moving to Glenwood Springs, Joe passed away from dropsy of the heart, which is the cutest disease I've ever. Dropsy. It sounds like a kid's character. I'm Dropsy the Clown. And Katy went on to do pretty well for herself. She turned the tavern into a restaurant called Commercial Restaurant. She bought a ranch and several other properties and traveled to Mexico, Great Britain, Germany, and Switzerland. She passed away from heart failure at the age of 70 on the 20th of January 1917, leaving a cash amount of $13,500. That's $331,000 today, and several properties to her remaining relatives. In her obituary, the Glenwood Post reported that there has just passed from the scene of action a character well known and loved in Glenwood Springs and Garfield County, as well as throughout the state of Colorado. No one but the recording angel will ever know the full extent of the kindly ministrations, the deeds of mercy, and helpfulness of this good woman who for so many years fought the battle of life alone and unaided, and yet, notwithstanding her busy life, always found time to be of service to those in distress or need. Mrs. Bender came in close contact with many unfortunates who could not be reached by those in other walks of life. To be sure, she was imposed upon. Many sought her aid and took advantage of her generosity under promise to reform and pay her for the assistance rendered, only to forget her ever afterwards. And yet, she seemed content in the thought that out of the flotsam and jetsam that drifted her way and took advantage of her generosity, some, yes, many, appreciated the kindness and showed her that appreciation by cleaner lives and better conduct because of the counsel and help of this friend of the unfortunate. So, is it possible that Pa and Ma Bender had somehow died out in the wilds of Chickasaw Nation, leaving John and Kate Bender to fend for themselves? Is it possible they then followed Frank McPherson to Colorado and decided to make themselves at home in the wild and lawless mining towns that were popping up all over the place? And is it possible that as soon as Pa Bender, Ma Bender, and John Bender were out of the picture, Katy Bender turned out to be a semi-decent person and a friend of the unfortunate? I mean, maybe. Or perhaps the beloved, caring, generous Auntie Katy J. Bender, who was buried in Glenwood Springs, isn't the Katy Bender who helped to murder several men and one child inside a lonely cabin back in Kansas. Is Katy Bender a particularly popular name? I don't feel like the surname Bender is very well known. Like, I've never known anyone called Bender or heard of anyone being called Bender outside of Futurama.
Bender, honey, we love you.
Shut up, baby, I know it.
According to Phyllis de la Garza, then again, perhaps two Katy Benders have been born in the same year, both German, with auburn hair, hazel eyes, a scarred left eye, and adept at making money while spinning clever yarns. Both married to shy, reclusive German blacksmiths named John and living within 300 miles of Cherryvale, Kansas in 1870. Two young women, exactly alike, who disappeared without a trace from 1873 to 1878. Exactly. Yes, they're the same person. And that's where we end today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. Hope you enjoyed it. If you're listening to this podcast, why not leave us a review on Spotify? That'd be awesome. Or a rating. You don't even have to write anything. You just leave a rating. 5 stars. Preferred, of course. And I'll see you next time.